The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor wax, clean but tired. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow on rows of wooden benches filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Some tapped nervously on their phones. Others stared at the floor, arms crossed tight like they were holding themselves together. It was just another Tuesday morning in the county courthouse, the kind of day that blurred into the next unless something unusual happened. And today, something unusual was about to. At the front of the room, behind a high wooden bench, sat the judge. She adjusted her robe with calm, practiced hands, eyes scanning the docket one last time before the bailiff called the next case. She'd been on the bench for 6 years now, long enough to know most days would be routine. Traffic violations, small claims, the occasional domestic dispute. She liked the rhythm of it. Predictable, fair, safe. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the quiet. People versus Jameson, case 24 CR 1187. Charge issuing a fraudulent check in the amount of $850. A man stood from the back row. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed at the toes. He walked slowly toward the defendant's table, shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. When he finally looked up, just for a second, the judge's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face, not from a mugshot, not from a prior case file, but from years ago, from a life she'd carefully boxed away and stored in the back of her mind. It was him, her ex-husband, the man she'd shared an apartment with, dreams with, quiet Sunday mornings with, before everything fell apart in a slow, painful unraveling neither of them had seen coming. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. For half a heartbeat, her mask slipped. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly. But then, like muscle memory, she pulled herself back. Chin level, shoulders straight. Voice steady when she finally spoke. "Please state your full name for the record." He turned toward her fully now, and recognition flickered in his eyes too. But only for a split second. Maybe he thought he was imagining things. Maybe he didn't trust his own memory after everything he'd been through. He cleared his throat. Daniel Jameson. She nodded, jotting something down she didn't need to write, just to give her hands something to do. Inside, her mind raced. What was he doing here? How had he ended up in her courtroom of all places? The odds were astronomical. The county had over 24 judges. Cases were assigned randomly. And yet, here they were. She forced herself to focus on the facts in front of her. The charge was serious enough, a felony, but not violent. The check had been written to a landlord, bounced, and the landlord had pressed charges after repeated failed attempts to collect. Standard procedure. But now it wasn't standard anymore. Now it was personal. She glanced at the file again. His address was a single-room occupancy hotel downtown. Employment, listed as intermittent labor. No prior felony convictions, just a couple of old misdemeanor citations from over a decade ago, parking tickets, a noise complaint. Nothing that painted him as a threat, just someone who'd fallen hard and hadn't been able to climb back up. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the people moved to hold the defendant on the full bail amount of $5,000. Given the nature of the offense and the defendant's lack of stable housing or income, we believe he presents a flight risk." The public defender, a young woman who looked like she'd had 3 cups of coffee just to make it through the morning, rose quickly. "Your Honor, Mr. Jameson has deep ties to the community. He's been caring for his mother, who's in hospice care. He missed a shift at his temp job the week the check bounced because he was at the hospital. He's not a flight risk. He has nowhere else to go and no one else to care for her." The judge listened, her expression unreadable. But inside, memories tumbled like loose stones. She remembered him talking about his mother once, years ago, during one of their late-night talks on the fire escape of their old building. "She raised me alone," he'd said, voice soft. "If anything ever happens to her, I'll be there. No matter what." She hadn't known then how much those words would echo years later, in a courtroom, under these circumstances. She looked at him now. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from guilt, she thought, but from exhaustion, from fear, from the kind of pressure that builds when you're one missed paycheck away from losing everything. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Jameson," she said, her voice calm but carrying through the quiet room, "do you understand the charge against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice rough but respectful. "And do you have anything you'd like to say before I rule on bail?" He hesitated, looked down, then back up at her. There was something in his eyes, not pleading exactly, but honesty, raw and unguarded. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I was trying to keep a roof over my mom's head while she's sick. I thought the check would clear. It didn't. I've been trying to make it right ever since." The courtroom was silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. She nodded slowly. Then, without revealing a single flicker of their shared past, she made her ruling. Bail is reduced to $500 with a condition of weekly check-ins with pretrial services. "Mr. Jameson, if you're unable to post bail today, I'll allow a review in 48 hours. Court adjourned. As the bailiff called the next case, she stood and exited through the side door, heart still pounding. She didn't look back. But she knew he was watching. Outside in the hallway, she leaned against the cool cinder block wall and closed her eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Judges didn't get entangled in their own histories. They stayed neutral, impartial, above it all. But life, she reminded herself, wasn't that neat. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a chance. Not to fix the past, but to do something right in the present. She took a deep breath, straightened her robe, and walked back toward her chambers. The morning wasn't over yet, and neither, it seemed, was their story. That night, the judge sat alone in her dimly lit study, a thick judicial ethics manual open on her desk. Rain tapped softly against the window, a steady rhythm that usually helped her think. But not tonight. Her mind kept circling back to the courtroom, to the man who'd stood before her. Not as a stranger, but as someone she once knew better than anyone. Someone she'd loved once, someone she'd walked away from when the weight of disappointment became too heavy to carry together. She flipped through the manual, fingers tracing the section on recusal. A judge shall disqualify themselves in any proceeding in which their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The words were clear. Clean. But life wasn't that simple. If she stepped aside now, the case would be reassigned, likely to one of the stricter judges downtown, the kind who saw every bounced check as a moral failing rather than a cry for help. And she knew, deep in her gut, that he couldn't afford that kind of judgment right now. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. It wasn't about favoritism. She wasn't planning to let him off easy. But she also knew his history, the real one, not just what was written in the file. She remembered how he used to fix things for neighbors without being asked. How he'd stayed up all night helping a friend move after a breakup. How he cried the first time his mother was hospitalized. He wasn't a criminal. He was a man drowning, and someone had mistaken his flailing for malice. Still, the risk was real. If anyone found out they'd been married even years ago, it could spark questions, accusations, maybe even an ethics complaint. Her reputation, carefully built over decades of hard work, could crack in an instant. But then again, wasn't justice supposed to be about more than rules on paper? Wasn't it about seeing people as they truly were? Across town, in a narrow room with peeling paint and a single flickering bulb, he sat on the edge of a thin mattress, staring at a photo taped to the wall. It showed an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, his mother smiling in a hospital bed holding his hand. He'd taken the picture the week before she'd gotten too weak to sit up. Now she was mostly asleep, drifting in and out, and he was the only one checking in on her. No other family. No safety net. He'd managed to scrape together $200 toward bail. A neighbor had lent him $50, but $500 still felt like a mountain, and if he didn't make bail by tomorrow, he'd miss his shift at the warehouse. And without that paycheck, he wouldn't be able to pay for the medicine his mom needed. He sighed, running a hand over his face. He hadn't expected to end up here. Not like this. After the divorce, he'd tried to rebuild, got a job, rented a room, stayed out of trouble. But life kept throwing curveballs. His mom's diagnosis, the temp agency cutting his hours, the landlord raising the rent. One bad month had turned into 2, then 3. In that check, it had been a desperate gamble. He'd thought his next paycheck would cover it. It didn't. Now he was staring down the barrel of a felony charge that could follow him forever, make it impossible to rent, to get a decent job, to care for the one person who'd always believed in him. He didn't know the judge recognized him, or if she did, he assumed it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light. But something about the way she'd looked at him, really looked, had unsettled him. There'd been no judgment in her eyes, just something else. Concern, recognition. He couldn't place it. The next morning he returned to court for the bail review wearing the same shirt, now slightly less wrinkled after a night of careful smoothing on the back of a chair. The courtroom was quieter this time, fewer people, the air less tense. When the judge entered, she gave no sign of recognition beyond the professional nod she gave every defendant. But as she took her seat, her eyes met his for just a second, long enough for him to feel a strange sense of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. She reviewed the pre-trial report quickly. He'd checked in. He'd provided his mother's medical records. He'd even brought a letter from the hospice nurse confirming his visits. The prosecutor still argued for stricter conditions, but the judge cut in gently. The court notes Mr. Jameson's consistent compliance and compelling personal circumstances. Bail is waived on the condition of electronic monitoring and continued weekly check-ins. He is to remain within the county and report any change in address immediately. Relief washed over him so strongly he nearly swayed on his feet. He wouldn't go to jail. He could keep working. He could keep caring for his mom. After the hearing, as he stepped out into the gray morning light, he paused on the courthouse steps. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, not because the problem was solved, but because someone had given him a chance to solve it himself. Back inside, the judge watched from her window as he walked away, shoulders a little straighter now. She knew she was walking a tightrope. Every decision from here on would be scrutinized, not just by the court but by her own conscience. But she also knew this. Sometimes fairness wasn't about treating everyone exactly the same. Sometimes it was about seeing what someone truly needed and having the courage to offer it even when it wasn't easy. She turned back to her desk, picked up her pen, and began preparing for the next case. But her thoughts lingered on the man who'd just walked out of her courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a reminder that behind every file, every charge, every docket number, there was a human being trying their best to survive. And maybe, just maybe, justice could be human too. The trial date arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Inside the courthouse, the usual hum of shuffling papers and murmured conversations filled the hallway. But in courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was heavier. This wasn't just another case anymore. Not to the people in the room, even if they didn't know why. The prosecutor had decided to move forward with the charge. It's a matter of principle, he'd told his team. We can't let people think they can write bad checks and walk away. He was young, ambitious, and saw this as a straightforward win, until he stepped into the courtroom and noticed the judge's unusually focused attention. The public defender, still juggling too many cases and too little time, had done what she could. She'd gathered receipts, hospital records, even a note from the hospice social worker, but she knew it wasn't enough. The law didn't care about hardship, at least not the kind that didn't come with official documentation stamped in triplicate. When the trial began, the prosecutor called the landlord first. A stout man in a rumpled suit took the stand and described how the check had bounced, how he'd sent notices, how he'd finally gone to the police after months of silence. I run a small business, he said, voice tight. I can't absorb losses like this. It's not personal, it's just business. The public defender cross-examined him gently. Did Mr. Jameson ever try to contact you after the check bounced? He left a couple of voicemails, the landlord admitted. Said he was dealing with a family emergency. But he never paid. No further questions, the defender said, sitting down with a quiet sigh. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then came the surprise. From the bench, the judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Landlord, she said, her voice calm but clear, you mentioned voicemails. Did you listen to them? The man shifted. I think so. Do you recall what he said? Well, he sounded stressed. Said his mother was in the hospital. That he'd get the money as soon as he could. And did you respond? I figured it was just an excuse. The courtroom was silent. The prosecutor frowned, glancing at his notes. This wasn't part of the script. The judge didn't press further. But everyone felt it, the shift. The case wasn't just about a check anymore. It was about whether someone's pain counted as an excuse. Or a reason. Next, the public defender called a witness of her own, the hospice nurse. She was soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a gentle demeanor. She confirmed that the defendant had been at the facility nearly every day for the past 3 months. He brings her tea, she said. Reads to her. Even when she's asleep, he sits by her bed. Most families don't do that, not at the end. The prosecutor tried to downplay it. Is it possible he exaggerated his involvement to gain sympathy? The nurse looked at him unflinching. You're welcome to check the visitor logs, or ask the other staff, or just go see for yourself. That stung. The prosecutor sat down without another word. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge, using a rarely exercised authority, called a brief recess. But before anyone could leave, she turned to the defendant. Mr. Jameson, she said, would you be willing to share with the court what your mother means to you? The room froze. Judges didn't ask personal questions like that. It wasn't procedure, but she'd done it anyway. He stood slowly, hands clasped in front of him. He looked at the judge, not with suspicion now, but with something like trust. She raised me alone, he began, voice rough. Worked 2 jobs most of my life. Never complained. When I messed up in school, she didn't yell. She sat me down and said, "You're better than this." He paused, swallowing hard. Now she's fading, and I want her last days to be peaceful. To know she's not alone. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. When the recess was called, people filed out quietly as if afraid to break the spell. In the hallway, the public defender wiped her eyes. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter, as if reminded why he'd taken this job in the first place. But the real shock came later. As the courtroom emptied, the defendant lingered near the defense table, gathering his papers. The judge was reviewing notes, head down, but then she looked up. Their eyes met, and this time there was no pretending. He froze. Recognition hit him like a wave. Not just that he knew her, but that she knew him. Really knew him. The late-night talks, the way he took his coffee, the scar on his left hand from fixing a bike when they were 25. All of it came rushing back. His face went pale. You, he whispered, too low for anyone else to hear. She didn't speak, just gave the smallest nod. Then she stood, adjusted her robe, and walked out through the side door, leaving him standing there, heart pounding, world tilting on its axis. Back in her chambers, she closed the door and leaned against it. She hadn't planned for that moment. Hadn't wanted it, but it happened anyway. And now there was no going back. She thought about recusing herself again. It would be the safe thing, the clean thing. But then she thought of him sitting by his mother's bedside, of the landlord who wouldn't return a call, of a system that often punished people for being poor instead of helping them rise. She thought about what justice really meant, not just enforcing rules, but restoring balance. She sat at her desk and opened the case file once more, not as a judge reviewing evidence, but as someone who remembered the man behind it. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not for a particular outcome, but for a chance to do something right, even if it wasn't by the book. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the courthouse lawn. Inside, 2 people carried the weight of a shared past, and the quiet possibility of a different kind of future. The trial would resume tomorrow. But something had already changed. Not in the law, but in the room where it was practiced, and sometimes that was enough. The courtroom felt different the next morning, quieter somehow, even with the same wooden benches and humming lights. People moved more slowly, spoke in lower voices, as if they sensed something important was about to happen. The prosecutor shuffled his notes with less confidence than before. The public defender sat a little straighter, her hand steady on the table. And the defendant? He kept his eyes down, but his shoulders weren't hunched anymore. There was a new kind of tension in him, not fear, but readiness. The judge entered precisely at 9. She wore the same black robe, the same calm expression, but those who watched closely might have noticed the slight pause she took before sitting, the way her fingers rested on the bench for just a second longer than usual. She knew what she was about to do wouldn't be typical. But after everything, the memories, the testimony, the quiet courage it took for one man to show up every day for someone who couldn't thank him anymore, typical didn't feel right. She cleared her throat. Before we proceed, she said, I've reviewed the statute regarding diversion for nonviolent first-time offenders under extenuating circumstances, specifically Section 1203(4)(c) of the Penal Code, which allows for dismissal upon successful completion of court-ordered conditions when justice would be better served by rehabilitation than punishment. The prosecutor blinked. Your Honor, with all respect, this isn't a first-time offense in the strictest sense. There are prior citations. Misdemeanors from over 12 years ago, the judge replied evenly. No convictions, no jail time, no pattern of behavior. And the current charge stems from documented medical and financial hardship. Not fraud, not deceit, but desperation. She looked at the file, then up at the defendant. Mr. Jameson has already complied with all pretrial conditions. He's maintained employment. He's cared for a terminally ill parent without state support. And he's shown consistent accountability. She turned to the prosecutor. Does the people oppose diversion on principle? Or is there evidence he poses a risk to public safety? The prosecutor hesitated. He glanced at the defendant, then at the judge's steady gaze. He'd come in expecting a conviction. But now, faced with the full picture, the words felt hollow. We don't have evidence of ongoing risk, Your Honor. Then the court finds that the interests of justice are best served by granting diversion. She turned to the defendant. Mr. Jameson, if you agree to complete 200 hours of community service with a court-approved organization, attend financial literacy counseling, and remain law-abiding for the next 12 months, this charge will be dismissed. No conviction will appear on your record. A soft gasp came from the back row. The public defender covered her mouth with her hand. Even the court reporter paused mid-stroke. He stood slowly. I accept, Your Honor, thank you. The gavel came down, once firm, final. Case dismissed upon successful completion of terms. Court adjourned. People began to rise, murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding like they'd just witnessed something rare and true. But before the room could empty, the judge added, Mr. Jameson, please remain behind for a moment. The door clicked shut behind the last person. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with years of silence, of distance, of things left unsaid. Then she stepped down from the bench. Not as a judge now, but as a person. I didn't know, she said quietly. About your mother. Not until that day. He nodded. I didn't know it was you until yesterday. A pause. Then almost a whisper. You could have recused yourself. I thought about it, she admitted. But I also thought, maybe I was the only one who'd see you as more than a file. He looked at her then, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Or just relief. You didn't have to do that. I didn't do it for us, she said gently. I did it because it was right. They stood there, two people who once shared a life, now standing in the ruins of it, not to rebuild, but simply to acknowledge what remained. Respect. Understanding. A shared humanity that time hadn't erased. I'm not the same person I was, he said after a while. I know, she replied. I'm not either. There was no grand apology. No dramatic reunion. Just two adults who'd made mistakes, carried regrets, and somehow, against all odds, found themselves on the same side of compassion. Before he left, she handed him a folded piece of paper. This is the contact for a nonprofit that helps with housing and job placement. They've worked with the court before. Tell them I sent you. He took it, fingers brushing hers for just a second. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. She didn't answer. Just gave a small nod. When he walked out, the courthouse steps felt different under his feet. Lighter somehow. Not because his problems were gone, but because someone had believed he deserved a chance to solve them. That was enough. More than enough. Back inside, she returned to the bench alone again, but the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. Later that afternoon, she filed a brief internal note, not for the record, but for herself. Just a line. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about remembering that everyone is fighting a battle we can't see. She didn't mention names. Didn't need to. Outside, the city carried on, cars honking, people rushing, life moving forward. But in that courtroom, something small and quiet had shifted. Not the law, but the way it was lived. And in a world that often felt cold and rigid, that small shift mattered more than most would ever know. 6 months later, on a bright Saturday morning, a small community center on the edge of the city bustled with quiet activity. Volunteers sorted donated clothes, stacked canned goods, and helped neighbors fill out job applications at folding tables. Near the back, a man in a clean work shirt and worn jeans knelt beside an elderly woman, patiently showing her how to use a tablet to video call her granddaughter. His voice was calm, his hand steady. He smiled when she laughed at something on the screen. He wasn't paid for this. He did it because he'd been given a second chance and he wanted to make sure others got one too. After the courtroom that day, he'd followed through on every condition. 200 hours of service, financial counseling, weekly check-ins. He'd even started taking night classes in basic accounting, something he'd always wanted to try. The nonprofit the judge had mentioned connected him with a housing program that helped him move his mother into a subsidized apartment with on-site medical support. She wasn't getting better. Her body was too worn, but she was comfortable now, surrounded by kindness. And he was there every evening, reading to her or just holding her hand in silence. He never spoke publicly about what happened in court. But word got around. People in the neighborhood knew he'd been in trouble, and they saw how he turned it around. That earned him more respect than any clean record ever could. Meanwhile, downtown in a quiet courthouse office, the judge reviewed a stack of routine motions. Her days were still filled with dockets, rulings, and the steady rhythm of justice. But something had shifted in her too. She found herself asking more questions during hearings, not just about the law, but about the person behind it. She started mentoring new public defenders, reminding them that their clients weren't cases. They were people with stories, struggles, and sometimes just one thread of hope left to hold on to. She never mentioned the case by name. But she kept a copy of the dismissal order in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that fairness could be flexible, that empathy wasn't weakness, it was strength wearing a different coat. Then one afternoon, a local reporter called. Someone had leaked a vague rumor. Judge lets ex-spouse off easy. The reporter was polite but probing. Can you confirm you knew the defendant personally? She didn't deny it. We were married over a decade ago, she said calmly. Long before I took the bench, I disclosed the potential conflict internally and consulted judicial ethics before proceeding. My ruling was based solely on the facts, the law, and the defendant's demonstrated accountability. The story ran a few days later, not as a scandal, but as a human interest piece. Some readers criticized her. Judges shouldn't handle cases involving exes, one comment read. But others wrote in support. Finally, a judge who sees people, not just crimes, said another. A retired teacher even sent a letter. You reminded us that the law can have a heart. The attention faded quickly. News cycles moved on. But the conversation lingered in legal circles, in community meetings, and late-night talks over kitchen tables. People began asking, what if more judges looked beyond the charge? What if second chances weren't rare exceptions, but part of how justice worked? Back at the community center, he finished his shift and stepped outside into the warm sun. A young man he'd been helping, a teenager who'd been cited for shoplifting, walked up, holding a job application. They said I need a reference, he mumbled, eyes down. Would you? He didn't hesitate. Of course. Come by tomorrow and we'll fill it out together. As he walked home, he passed a bench where an older man sat feeding pigeons. They nodded at each other, the kind of quiet acknowledgement strangers share when they've both seen hard days. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything, how one decision, one act of unexpected grace had changed the course of his life. He didn't know if he'd ever see the judge again, and that was okay. They didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the past they shared, but the future they'd each chosen to build, separately, but with the same quiet belief that people could change. One evening, months later, the judge attended a small ceremony at the same community center. She wasn't there in her official role, just as a guest invited to speak briefly about civic engagement. When she arrived, she saw him across the room, helping set up chairs. Their eyes met. No surprise, no awkwardness, just a nod, a small smile. Then they both turned back to their tasks. Later, during her short talk, she didn't mention the case. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It happens when we choose to see each other's humanity, when we offer help instead of judgment, when we believe in someone before they've proven they deserve it. Afterward, as people mingled over coffee and cookies, he approached her. You were right, he said simply. About what? That everyone deserves dignity. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man from the courtroom, not the ghost of her past, but someone who'd risen, You earned yours, she said. I just made space for it. They didn't hug, didn't promise to stay in touch. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Forgiveness, not for each other, but for the versions of themselves they used to be. And hope for the people they'd become. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the city, life went on. The courthouse would open again Monday. The community center would welcome more volunteers. And somewhere another person would stand in a courtroom, scared and alone, wondering if anyone would see them for who they really were. But now, because of two people who chose compassion over convenience, the answer might just be yes.